Okay, so in the previous lecture, I talked about immigration up until the 1930s and then Mexican schools in the 1920s and 40s. Today, I'm continuing chronologically, although with less of a focus on immigration. Today, I'll be focusing on World War II and the US home front. Like I mentioned before in the previous lecture, I talked about repatriation, how there were between 500,000 and 2 million ethnic Mexicans that were pressured to leave the US into Mexico. The majority were US born. And so that's kind of some of the background to this. Now, with a focus on World War II and the US home front. So World War II begins in 1939. The US doesn't enter World War II until 1941. What about the home front? What is that? Usually the front is a reference to the front lines of where the soldiers and the enemy soldiers are fighting from. The home front is a reference to how are people back home who are not in the battle lines, in the front lines, how are they fighting to help win this war? And so that's what the home front is a reference to. All right, so Pearl Harbor happens in December of 1941. And that is the incident that gets the US to officially declare itself on the side of the Allies against the Axis. So yeah, that's what officially gets us into the war. Now, within hours of Pearl Harbor, the FBI arrested 1,200 Japanese people, also known as Issei. Issei is Japanese, Nisei is Japanese Americans. Within hours, they arrest 1,200, excuse me. Now, even though they arrested 1,200 people, none were ever convicted or proven to have done anything like espionage to help Japan attack the United States. There were 10 people that were convicted of espionage. None of them were Japanese or Japanese American. So in February of 1942, President FDR gives his Executive Order 9066 that led to the internment of 120,000 people, 2/3 of which were Nisei, US citizens of Japanese descent. Also interesting to note that Executive Order 9066, even though it targeted Japanese and Japanese Americans, it never specifically mentioned what group it was intended to target. So Japanese and Japanese Americans were given a notice in February of 42 that they needed to, they had a couple months to put their affairs in order because they were going to be put into these internment camps. They were sent on trains. Here you have a child being hauled away with a tag on that child in April of 42. Now, the idea for these internment camps is that people in the US were afraid that after bombing Pearl Harbor, Japan would then try to attack the US West Coast. So the idea was to remove Japanese and Japanese Americans from the West Coast, move them to the interior of the country, where they would not be in a position to help Japan attack the west coast of the United States. So first they were put into temporary assembly centers before they were moved further east into these longer term internment camps. Now, regarding Hawaii and regarding other groups of people, Hawaii in 1942 or in December of 41, Hawaii was not a US state. Hawaii was a territory that we had acquired since the Spanish-American War in 1898. But it was not, and so therefore we had a military base there, but it was not a US state. It didn't become a US state until 1959. Now, another ironic thing is that Hawaii had more Japanese people than any other place in the United States. Almost 40% of the population in Hawaii in 1942 was Japanese, and we did not do any mass internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans in Hawaii, where they made up the largest population and where there had actually been an attack already. With regard to Germans and Italians, similar to the 1,200 Issei that were arrested within hours of Pearl Harbor, there were Germans and Italians that were arrested by the FBI once we entered this war. But there was no mass internment for Germans and German Americans or Italians and Italian Americans the way there was for Japanese and Japanese Americans. The government had an Office of War Information. It was basically a department of propaganda during World War II. It's a department in charge of what information they wanted the US public to know. And so these are some pictures, showing what they wanted the public to see these internment camps as, people are smiling, yes, they're behind barbed wire, but they're smiling, they're well dressed, they have dances, they're trying to portray them as being treated well. These are not pictures from the Office of War Information. Pictures of how people in the public were treating their Japanese and Japanese American neighbors. They were cheering the removal, the internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans. They're, this whole kind of good riddance, we don't want them and we don't want them to come back, not just for the war, but ever, people with, they boarded up their house and people vandalized it, insulting the families that live there. Big signs telling people they're not wanted. Now, it's important to be made aware that, say, for example, most of you during most of your lives, the United States has been bombing places, has had troops fighting in other countries throughout most of your lives, if not your entire lives. But yet your everyday experience isn't much affected by the fact that the United States is not officially at war, but yet having soldiers killing people and, US bombs killing people in other countries of the world. So this is to say that even though the US has been US bombs have been killing people, US soldiers have been on the ground in other countries throughout your lives, this is different from an experience of total war. World War II was this experience of total war. This meant that it wasn't just the people in the front lines that were fighting. People in the home front had to do their share, everything they could, to help those soldiers in the front lines win this war. Again, there was this Office of War Information. They made posters. They made newsreels that you'd go to the movies to watch a movie, and first, instead of getting previews for another movie in the future, you'd get these newsreels telling you what they wanted the public to know. And so these posters are examples of how the government is encouraging people to fight in the home front, to do what they can at home to help win this war. And so this one, for example, is saying, you have to carpool. Don't drive your car by yourself and waste the gas. When you ride alone, you're riding with Hitler. You're helping him by wasting gas. Here is for people that are students or people who work in offices. Don't throw away paper. Don't throw away paper clips or pencils or even short stubby pencils, or rubber bands, because, your waste helps the enemy. And again, kind of this, this turning into the image of Hitler. Apparently, people were asked to save the grease from when they cooked at home. You had to take it to your local butcher shop or meat dealer. And apparently, somehow they turned this into some kind of explosive. And by 1943, the public was starting to grow tired of a lot of these sacrifices that they were being asked to make. And so hence posters like this that say, you talk of sacrifice. He knew the meaning of sacrifice, meaning, you're not risking your life fighting Japan. The soldiers in the front line are the ones that know about sacrifice. So don't complain. And by this time of 1943, when people were increasingly complaining back home about everything they were asked to sacrifice, a lot of the public and a lot of the media were interpreting this dissatisfaction with the sacrifices they were being asked to make. They were being portrayed to the public by the media as growing tension between different racial groups, in particular African Americans and Anglo Americans. And so the Office of War Information created these posters, in particular reaching out toward African Americans to make sure they would support this war. First, they're given the example of Dobie Miller. Now, in December of 1941, the US military was segregated. And African Americans that were in the US military were segregated. They were put in subservient positions. So they were essentially discouraged from being in positions of fighting in the front lines, for example, if and when the US enters the war. So in that context, Dobie Miller was an African American sailor in the Navy in Pearl Harbor when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, even though Dobie Miller, his job was to be a cook, his job wasn't to shoot down Japanese airplanes. When a person that was shooting the artillery up in the air got shot down, Dobie Miller went above and beyond his responsibilities, above and beyond the call of duty, and took over that artillery piece and started shooting up at the planes that were trying to bomb them. He ended up getting the Navy Cross, which is the highest award awarded by the Navy, and it's the second highest award in the military to a soldier. So there, you're given the good example. Here's Dobie Miller, even though he was segregated, and even though he was, quote unquote, just a cook, he went above and beyond. Follow his example. Then they were also given the example of Private Joe Louis. If you haven't heard of Joe Louis was the heavyweight boxing champion of the world at the beginning of World War II. And he enlisted in the military. And so he was seen as another good example for African Americans to follow. And, this carried a lot of weight. The heavyweight boxing champion of the world was essentially considered like the alpha male of the United States for most of the 20th century, if not all the 20th century. And so this carried a lot of weight when boxing was kind of the most macho sport of the century. For most of the century, for sure. Today boxing doesn't get a lot of attention. Now it's maybe like mixed martial arts and things like that get more attention. But back then, it was certainly boxing. So yeah, African Americans should follow the example of Joe Louis and serve. And not only that, but also, you should do your part, and we're gonna win because we're on God's side. So either do it because Joe Louis is doing it, or do it because, we're on God's side and God is gonna help us win as well. Now I'm gonna introduce 3 ways that Mexico helped, Mexico and Latinos in general, contributed toward the war effort. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'm going to go into greater detail into each one of the 3. The Bracero Program was an agreement between the United States and Mexico to bring workers from Mexico to the United States because the United States had a labor shortage during World War II, and they worked primarily in agriculture and railroad building. Another way that Mexico helped was with the 201st Fighter Jet Squadron, Escuadron 201, where Mexico provided 30 pilots and a crew of 300 to help the United States fight in the Pacific as we island hopped, making our way closer and closer to being able to attack Japan directly. A third way that Latinos helped in this war is by enlisting directly in the US military. This included Mexican citizens, Mexican Americans who were US citizens, and other Latino groups, especially Puerto Ricans. There were a total of 500,000 Latinos that served in the US military during World War II. These Latinos ended up earning a disproportionate number of Congressional Medals of Honor. The Medal of Honor is the highest award that the military gives to soldiers. And Latinos earned a disproportionate number, meaning they earned a percentage of Congressional Medals of Honor that are higher than their percentage of the US population. And so that's what it means to earn a disproportionate number. Now a little bit more detail about each one of these three. Again, the first, the Bracero Program. Like I mentioned, an agreement between the United States and Mexico to bring workers from Mexico to work in the United States because of the labor shortage caused by the war. Now, I've mentioned in a previous lecture how ever since the Immigration Act of 1917, people from Mexico, if they came in to the United States on economy, like if they couldn't afford first class railroad or train tickets, if they came in economy, then they and their clothes had to be fumigated. And so this happened to braceros as well. And so here you can see people being medically evaluated in mass without a lot of room for privacy or kind of dignified treatment. And I'll continue on some of these. There were 40 to 60,000 braceros that came every year. Again, during the war, working on railroads and agriculture. Now, this was intended to only be a temporary need during World War II. But farm owners throughout the United States ended up liking the Bracero program. And so they lobbied Congress to renew the Bracero program every year, way beyond the end of World War II in 1945, all the way until 1964. And so after World War II, it's just in agriculture. But way beyond, until 1964. Now, the Bracero program included protections for these workers. Mexico negotiated with the United States for protections like, you're going to ship them in free of cost. You're going to ship them back free of cost. You're going to provide decent housing. There's going to be, healthy meals available to them. You're going to help open a savings account for them to come out of this with a savings, some savings and so forth. There were protections for them. Now, the state of Texas did not agree to these protections. So Mexico did not send braceros to Texas until 1947, a couple years after the end of World War II. And on that note, Texas also helped, how do I put it? Texas would not agree to the protections for braceros, but that didn't stop Texas from encouraging undocumented Mexicans from coming into Texas to work and still benefit from their labor, only without the protections of the Bracero program. So Texas helped create an undocumented population by not agreeing to these protections for the braceros. And like I mentioned, people were fumigated. They were fumigated with a pesticide called DDT. This is something that did not start with the Bracero program. It started since the Immigration Act of 1917. And in 1917, there was an incident, again, but way before the Bracero program in 1942. There was an incident in 1917 referred to as the Bath Riots, because there was a woman, a Mexican woman, young woman, who was crossing into the US-Mexico border every day to work. And on this occasion, she protested. She protested that she did not want to be fumigated. And other women and other people in general joined in on this protest. And it ended up turning into riots. And it's remembered as the Bath Riots of 1917 that initiated with a young Mexican woman protesting the fumigating of them. So DDT was used on the people. Cyclone B was used on their clothing. Zyklon B is a chemical that was used by the Nazis in the gas chambers. And there are German Nazi documents where they say that they were inspired by the US treatment of Mexican people at the US-Mexico border after 1917, and the use of their Cyclone B, and in general, the way they fumigated people, was part of their inspiration for their own treatment of people in their own camps during World War II. And here is a picture of these people, again, in mass, being fumigated. This idea that they were dirty people that would bring in diseases is what was used to justify this treatment. And here's the braceros working in the fields. And a little bit more detail about the 201st Mexican Fighter Squadron, Escuadron 201. They also refer to themselves as Las Águilas Aztecas, the Aztec Eagles. Again, it was 30 pilots, 30 Mexican pilots, and a crew of 300 men who fought with the United States, helping the United States island hop, making their way closer and closer to Japan until they can bomb Japan directly. And here's an unofficial mascot, kind of like a Mexican Woody Woodpecker that they called Pancho Pistola. It's kind of like a Pistol Pete kind of name. This is the plane that they flew, the Republic P-47D Thunderbolt. And the 201st Mexican Fighter Squadron fought 96 combat missions, and they had 3 of their pilots killed in combat. And this is a memorial in Mexico commemorating this Mexican contribution to World War II and trying to help the Allies win. All right, then the third way I mentioned is the enlistment in the US military by Mexican citizens, Mexican Americans who were US citizens, and other Latinos, especially Puerto Ricans. Now, the majority of these 500,000 Latinos were Mexican American. Between 350 and 375,000 were Mexican Americans. The next single nationality were Puerto Ricans, 65,000, and then the balance were other Latinos, either Mexican citizens or Latinos of other backgrounds. They earned 17 Congressional Medals of Honor, which again was a percentage of Medals of Honor higher than their percentage of the population. I mentioned before that by 1943, there was growing dissatisfaction with the home front and the sacrifices that people were asked to make. A lot of this dissatisfaction ended up getting interpreted by the media and the public as growing racial tensions. And so hence, again, Office of War Information creating posters, encouraging people to stay united and work together, in particular across racial lines. And it's in this context that I introduce you to Zoot Zooters and Pachucos. What is a Zoot Zoot? This is an example of a Zoot Zoot. It is a style of dress that was first worn by jazz musicians, African-American jazz musicians in the 1930s. From there, it grew in popularity among African Americans and people who enjoyed jazz music and dancing to jazz music, going to concerts and dances and that sort of thing. Now, by World War II, this Zoot was being portrayed as unpatriotic by the mainstream media. Why? Because it was larger and more stylish than necessary. It was interpreted as a waste of material. You know, there was the big hat. The coat was not just to the waist, not just below the waist. It could come down all the way down to the knees. The coat could also be double-breasted. And so that means there's like 2 rows of buttons instead of just one. The pants were high-waisted, so, you know, more material because they're up higher. They were baggy at the knees, and so again, excess interpreted as excess material. And then they were narrow at the ankle, which they called the cuff. And so these pants, these clothes were designed to lend themselves for dancing without feeling restricted. It was a way of being dressed up, but yet very comfortably dressed to be able to move and dance. And so it could also include necklaces, in particular gold necklaces. It could include pocket chains or wallet chains. That could also be, you know, made of gold. And so this, in that context of total war, is where this was interpreted as these young people are being unpatriotic. And it came with a lot more beyond that. It came with, you know, these juveniles must be juvenile delinquents. They must be unpatriotic. They must be lazy. They must be draft dodgers. People just assumed all these things and created this stereotype of a Mexican American juvenile delinquency problem associated with people who wear zoot suits. Now, the part that they weren't getting is that the defense industry, the fact that we got involved in World War II is what brought people out of the Great Depression of the 1930s. It provided young people an opportunity to get jobs and make money for the first time in a long time. And young people are young people. They want to dress nice. They want to go to dances. They want to be flashy and be seen in public, especially in an urban setting of that time. And so they used their newfound expendable income, you know, to go out, to go to movies and go to dances and dress up as nice as they could. But to the mainstream public, this was not a time for this kind of behavior. They interpreted it as unpatriotic. And so yeah, that's the Zoot Suit. What about Pachuco? So a Pachuco was a young male Mexican American, although they would have used just the word Mexican, who wore a Zoot Suit in the 1940s. And then because of the Zoot Suit riots, ends up being associated primarily with Los Angeles. So they wear the Zoot Suit, they wear the hat, you know, the long coat, the pants. It's not a uniform. People did what they could by tailoring their own suits. There's also this hairstyle, the ducktail hairstyle, that is associated with it. And so, yeah, that's a Pachuco. Mexican-American young male who wore a zoot suit in the 1940s. And after the Zoot Suit riots, gets associated primarily with Los Angeles. All right, so at the time that the Braceros, and so, you know, at first, the big fear was Japanese and Japanese Americans. After they were put in internment camps in the early 1940s, in early 1942, then by summer of 42, we start having braceros come in from Mexico. And so then the next big group that was targeted to be afraid of were Mexican people and ethnic Mexicans in general. And so the media started talking about a growing Mexican crime wave, especially among juveniles. Juvenile delinquents is what they called them. And just so I don't forget to say this later, so the media portrayed it as a growing Mexican crime wave. The newspapers, the radio news, and so forth would all talk about this growing Mexican crime wave. The police would arrest, would specifically target Mexican-American young people and arrest them, only to release them for lack of evidence once they get into, the police station. And just so I don't forget to mention, after the Zoot Suit riots, there was an investigation done by the government to look into whether this, to document this growing alleged Mexican crime wave. And what they found is that juvenile delinquency had gone up a little bit during the first couple years of the war, but that among Mexican Americans, it had actually gone down during the war years. And so this proves that what the media and everyone was talking about was completely fabricated. It was about growing fears about a Mexican crime wave, not about reality. But because people at the time believed that there was a growing Mexican crime wave, the Attorney General of the state of California told Los Angeles police authorities that they needed to crack down on this supposed Mexican crime wave. And so that is why the government's reaction to the Sleepy Lagoon incident was so overblown. Yeah, so in August of 1942, Los Angeles police authorities were told to crack down on Mexican crime wave. And this incident occurred, that is where they decided, okay, this is the incident that we're gonna publicize throughout newspapers to demonstrate that we're cracking down on this alleged Mexican crime wave. It's called the Sleepy Lagoon incident. Now, why is it called Sleepy Lagoon? It actually wasn't even a real lagoon. It was a gravel pit where water accumulated. But Mexican-American youth in particular would go there and hang out. Young people would go there to hang out because this was during segregated Los Angeles. Mexican-American youth or ethnic Mexicans, for example, could not sit in the main part of a theater when they were playing movies in English. They had to sit up in the balcony where the people who sat in the main part of the theater wouldn't have to see them because they were out of sight. This was when, and I forget what day, I think the public swimming pools, I think they drained them of the water and put in new water like every Thursday. So African Americans could only use it on Wednesdays, right before they drained the pool every week. And Mexican Americans couldn't use it till Wednesday, a day before African Americans, before it would get drained and they would put fresh water in. And so it's in that context that people of color did not feel safe, did not feel welcomed going to, say, the beach, or to other more mainstream locations. So Sleepy Lagoon is what they called this gravel pit that they could go to without being harassed by the police or authorities, or that anyone would complain about. So it's in this context that Henry Leyva, also known as Hank Leyva, Hank is a nickname for people named Henry. Henry or Hank Leyva goes with his girlfriend to Sleepy Lagoon, drives there in his car, to hang out with his girlfriend there. And this was also a hangout spot, a makeout spot. How do I put this? So back then, this is before there was even one car per family in the United States. There was less than one car per family. And so a young person having access to a car was a very appealing thing. You know, you wanted to have friends or significant others, you know, who had a car. There was you know, it was part of the appeal, I suppose. So yeah, you know, young people would go out as couples to Sleepy Lagoon and make out. It was a makeout spot. So Hank Leyva goes to Sleepy Lagoon with his girlfriend. But while he's there, he encounters some young men from a different neighborhood called Downey, and they beat up Hank Leyva. Hank Leyva goes back to where he lives, which is 38th Street, gets his friends, and goes back to Sleepy Lagoon to look for the Downey boys. While Hank Leyva was going to get his friends, the Downey boys went to a party at the Delgadillo house and got kicked out of that party because they weren't invited, and they got kicked out, and I think they even got into a fight. So then when the 38th Street youths arrive to Sleepy Lagoon and start looking for the Downey boys, they come across this party. They go to the party to see if the Downey boys are there. The people at the party think that the 38th Street youths are the Downey boys coming back upset after they got kicked out. And so then they get into a fight with the 38th Street youths. They also get kicked out. And after that, they discover the body of Jose Diaz, mortally wounded. He's taken by ambulance to the hospital, and he dies en route to the hospital. Now, normally, this would have just been another Mexican-American person who was mortally wounded and goes to the hospital. But police authorities decided this was going to be the case that they were going to make an example out of, to demonstrate to the public and to the Attorney General of the state that police authorities were cracking down on this alleged Mexican crime wave. So police go around and arrest almost 600 Mexican-American youths with any excuse. If they were wearing zoot suits, if they were riding in a car and they had a baseball bat in the car, it didn't matter if they were on their way to a baseball game. There were people arrested for having a tire iron in their car because that was a weapon, even though everyone should have a tire iron in their car along with a spare tire in case they ever need to, in case they ever get a flat tire and need to change a tire. So almost 600 youths are arrested, and they ultimately decide that the 38th Street youths, who were last at the Delgadillo house party, that were the most likely to have had something to do with this. And so they tried them. They had a case against them in mass. As you can see from this picture, women were also among the youths arrested. And you can see how these Mexican-American young women also participated to various degrees in Pachuco culture. The long coats to the knees. There's one of the women also, one of these women also has the Zoot pants, baggy at the knees. And most of these women also have the pompadour hairstyle. You might recall from the movie that you watched for the class, My Family, there was a scene where they show a young woman at a dance with pompadour hair. And when her boyfriend gets into a fight, she pulls out a knife out of her pompadour hairstyle. And that was part of the reputation of these young women. If they had a pompadour hairstyle, they might have a knife, or they might have razor blades in their hair. And that was kind of a defensive tactic, so that if these young women got into a fight with another young woman and they try to grab them from their hair, you know, they would cut their hands when they grab their hair because they had razor blades in it. You know, whether this happened or not, you know, that was the reputation. So ultimately, they decide the 38th Street youths are the ones that are going to get arraigned and tried. Here are the 38th Street youths. The state, again, was trying to demonstrate to the public that they were cracking down on this alleged Mexican crime wave. So they do a bunch of things that they would normally not do, or the things they do were not coincidental. One of those is the judge put in charge of the case. The judge had the nickname of San Quentin Fricky because Judge Fricky was the judge who had sent the most people to San Quentin State Penitentiary. And so it wasn't coincidence they put the toughest judge on this case. And then the case ended up focusing more on defamation of character than on actually trying to figure out who was responsible for mortally wounding Jose Diaz. And so they did things that they normally wouldn't do. For example, the youths were not allowed to change their clothes for weeks because the prosecution argued that their wearing of Zoots was evidence of their criminality. It was proof that they were juvenile delinquents. They were not allowed to get haircuts because of that ducktail hairstyle that was associated with Pachucos. They had a so-called expert witness, which was Sheriff's Lieutenant Ayers. And part of his supposed expert testimony included that comparing Mexican-American youth to Anglo-American youth was like comparing wild cats to domesticated cats. While Anglo-American youth might enjoy getting into a fight, Mexican-American youth wouldn't fight fair, and they liked using weapons and liked drawing blood. And Mexican-American youth are descendants of the Aztecs, and the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice, which is evidence of them having, you know, this bloodthirst in their genes. And the Aztecs were Native Americans who came over the Bering Strait from Asia, trying to make a connection between Japan, who we're at war with and are afraid we're going to get bombed by, and these Pachucos, these Mexican-American youth. Now, in terms of constitutional rights, the biggest issue, despite all these things being issues, is that they did not have access to their lawyers when the case, how do I say this, when the trial was in process. And so this is a constitutional right that they were negated. And so they were tried in mass. They would have them sit all together. It was convenient for good pictures for the media to, again, show how they were cracking down on these Pachucos. And so again, it's no surprise that all of the youth were convicted for the death of one person. It is the largest mass trial in California history. 3 of them were given life sentences. 9 of them were given 5 years to life. 5 of them were given 1 year in county jail. Now, these were all the youth who were not able to afford their own private lawyer. There were 2 youths who were able to afford their own lawyer. Their cases were dismissed immediately for lack of evidence. I should also mention that, although I don't want to complicate things too much, but a couple of the Sleepy Lagoon defendants were also not Mexican American, were of different white ethnic backgrounds. But they lived in the same neighborhood and were part of the same social group and so forth. What about the women who were also arrested? The ones who lived on 38th Street, the young men got an unfair trial, but the women didn't even get that. They didn't get a trial at all. Not even an unfair one, which is more unfair. Police authorities convinced their parents to have them sent to the Ventura School for Girls, which sounds fine. Sounds like a school for girls. But it was a correctional facility, meaning, you know, it's for people to get punished. And again, they didn't have a trial. And they weren't just held there until they turned 18. They were held there until they turned 21, which is longer. They were there longer than any of the boys were in jail. And here you see them again with their pompadour hairstyle. For some of them, you can kind of see the makeup. So after they were sentenced to jail, there was a Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee that fought to win an appeal of that case and its decision. The backbone of that committee was Alice Greenfield McGrath. At the time, she kind of played the role of the secretary, but in retrospect, and historians recognize that she was actually the backbone of the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee. At the time, the people that would get more attention were celebrities who would help fundraise for the defense, for example. But ultimately, Alice Greenfield McGrath was the backbone of that defense. Now, the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee got most of its support from labor organizers, from unions, and from the Jewish American community. And it can also be counterintuitive, but the ethnic Mexican community, a lot of it distanced themselves from the Pachucos instead of standing up for them or sticking their neck out in their defense. One example, in the Spanish language newspaper of La Opinión, they put out an editorial saying, you know, just in case you're wondering, Pachucos do not come from the Mexican city of Pachuca. So, don't associate them with us. Don't blame us as their origin. Or another example was there was a group of Mexican American high school girls who were complaining about the reputation of Pachucas, where Pachucas were being portrayed as Mexican American female juvenile delinquents that were sexually promiscuous and so forth. And so these Mexican American high school young women wrote a letter to the newspaper saying, don't associate all Mexican American young women with Pachucas. In fact, we're willing to subject ourselves to medical, to a doctor's, what's the right word? Like a doctor's appointment, to confirm that we're not sexually promiscuous. Basically this idea of checking to make sure they're virgins. And so, just again, it can be counterintuitive in retrospect, but it is not uncommon for people to distance themselves from the groups that are being targeted by the government and society in general. And by the way, this could also serve as an example of for the final essay for this class. One of the prompts in the final essay asks you to identify and explain why there are instances in history where people distance themselves or work against members of their own community, ethnic or racial community or class. And so this could serve as an example of that, in case you want to do that final essay prompt for the final. For the first test, you watched the documentary by PBS made by the American Experience about the Zoot riots. There's also a Hollywood film called American Me, where the first few minutes reenact the Zoot riots. I'm not going to play that, but you're welcome to look it up and watch it. Now, the Sleepy Lagoon trial. Okay, so we have the Sleepy Lagoon incident in August of 42. You have that results in the death of Jose Diaz. Then you have the trial from October of 42 to January of 43, where 17 youth are convicted for the death of Jose Diaz. And then in June of 1943 is when the Zoot riots begin. So all this effort of Los Angeles police authorities calling in the media to take pictures of them arresting and arraigning and trying and putting a tough, covering the Sleepy Lagoon case, the media kind of documenting the case throughout the case and so forth. Instead of having the intended effect of demonstrating that they were cracking down on this alleged Mexican crime wave, it had the opposite effect. Instead, it made it so that this was bigger news, and the public got the impression that this was even more out of control than they previously thought. And that's what helps lead to the Zoot riots, where people start taking the law into their own hands, targeting Zooters and Pachucos, because they just assume all these negative things about them, that they're juvenile delinquents, that they're draft dodgers, that they're unpatriotic, that they use marijuana, all these, this whole negative stereotype that is promoted by the mainstream media against Pachucos. All right, the Zoot riots happened for 10 days in downtown Los Angeles from June 3rd to June 13 in 1943. And this initiated with sailors from a Navy base in the ethnic Mexican neighborhood of Chavez Ravine. And the sailors that were in this base, in this ethnic Mexican neighborhood, they would have to go through 3 ethnic Mexican neighborhoods to get to downtown Los Angeles, where they would go when they were on leave. So, you know, they were young men getting ready to be sent to war. And when they would get time off, when they would get free time, they would go through these ethnic Mexican neighborhoods and back to go to downtown, to go to the movies, go to restaurants, go to bars, go to dances and so forth. And then when they would come back, you know, they would be drunk and going through these ethnic Mexican neighborhoods. And so the base being in this ethnic Mexican neighborhood and these sailors going back and forth through these neighborhoods when they were drunk helped lead to growing tensions in these neighborhoods, and particularly with the sailors of this base. At the time, this was interpreted as basically macho rhetoric. The sailors would talk about the Pachucos verbally harassing their girlfriends, their sisters, their mothers, when they would go to the Navy base to visit them. And the Pachucos would argue that these sailors would walk through their neighborhoods all drunk and be insulting, again, their girlfriends, their sisters, their mothers. And so there was all this rhetoric of, you know, them insulting our women, quote unquote, and this kind of macho, sexist language of the time. So on June 3rd, 1943, there was a sailor that got beat up by some Pachucos. The sailor goes back to the Navy base, recruits all his friends, goes back to these ethnic Mexican neighborhoods in downtown Los Angeles, looking for Pachucos to beat up. And every day over the course of 10 days, this just escalated. Initially, it was just sailors. Then it was members of other branches of the military. Then it was also civilians. So this begins on a Thursday. By Monday, there are thousands of people in downtown Los Angeles looking for Pachucos to beat up. They would have caravans, you know, a line of vehicles, all making their way, looking for Pachucos to beat up. They would beat up the Pachucos, and they would cut their hair. They would cut or rip up their clothing. The police would follow these mobs and then arrest not the rioters, but the Pachucos who had, after they got beat up. And they would charge them with disturbing the peace. Here's one example of 2 Pachucos. The mob went into a Spanish language theater, turned on the lights, went in there, dragged these 2 young men they thought were Pachucos, beat them up. And then afterwards, the police arrested the 2 young men who got beat up, not the rioters. The military police would arrest the sailors, but they would just take them back to the base and let them go. They weren't, you know, charged with anything or tried or sentenced or convicted. Now, you know, the Pachucos were not just innocent victims. They fought back as best they could. And so there were also servicemen that were injured, like this one who made it to the newspaper. But the police authorities were completely incapable of stopping the riots because they were helping them. They were essentially encouraging it. They were allowing it all to happen. The riots did not end until the Navy itself declared downtown Los Angeles out of bounds, restricted for sailors. That's when sailors stopped going in there. At that point, however, some of the rioting spread to other parts of Los Angeles, other parts of Southern California, and even other parts of the country. Here's an example of Mexican-American and African-American young men who, south of Los Angeles, in a neighborhood called Watts, they were they were arrested for throwing rocks at the electric trolley cars that would take people from the port of Los Angeles to downtown Los Angeles and would go through their neighborhood of Watts. One of the ways the city of Los Angeles reacted to the riots was the city council tried to make the wearing of a zoot suit punishable by 30 days in jail. This ultimately did not end up being passed, but it was one of the things they tried to do. Now, the federal government, with their U.S. War Production Board, they actually outlawed the manufacturing of zoot suits. They tried to stop the manufacturers of suits from manufacturing zoot suits. This is the only time in US history that the US has tried to outlaw a style of dress, an article of clothing. Now, the reason I say they tried is not because they didn't do it, not because they didn't pass laws to do it. It's because everyone found loopholes around it. The manufacturers, the government would have to define what is a zoot suit, and they might say, it's made of this material and it's got, these dimensions at the waist and at the knee and at the cuff and so forth. And the manufacturers would just alter those measurements and say they're no longer zoot suits. Not to mention the fact that everyday people could just buy a suit or borrow a suit or have a hand-me-down suit from an older sibling or parent, take it to a tailor and have it turned into a zoot suit. And so there were lots of ways around it, but still significant that it's the only time in US history that the government tried to prevent the manufacture of a type of clothing. So yeah, it was not a uniform. Here's a close-up of that hairstyle where it's longer in the back and then kind of crisscrosses in the back. And they called it a ducktail hairstyle. They also called it a DA for like a duck's butt for DA hairstyle. Again, not a uniform. People made do with what they had and turned it into a zoot suit as best they could. And this was not just worn, zoot suits were not just worn by Mexican Americans. Like I mentioned before, zoot suits were first worn by jazz musicians in the 1930s, but it ended up becoming popular among all racial and ethnic minority groups throughout the United States. This also serves as a reminder that people like Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans were not yet considered white. All these groups don't become white until after suburbanization in the 1950s. Prior to this, at this time, all these groups are considered ethnic whites, kind of distinct ethnic groups. They're not considered mainstream Anglo whites. And so all these, it becomes a subculture popular among many marginalized groups in society. And so African Americans, Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, Japanese Americans all participated in this Zoot culture. Another aspect associated with Pachucos was their language, their slang. Calo means slang in Spanish. And so Pachuco Calo would be the name of their dialect or slang. It had to varying degrees of Spanish and African American jive or African American slang incorporated in it. Another aspect of their culture is the tattoo of the cross. Now, for us today, the tattoo of the cross might seem as, I don't know, like a little detail, because now anyone can wear a whole sleeve, or in order to be extreme today, you have to have tattoos in your face. Everything else is pretty much accepted. But back then, if you had even a small tattoo like this one, it was because you were in jail or you were a sailor. Like, it was associated with people who were not afraid of not being able to be hired at a respectable job because you have a visible tattoo. All right. I'm gonna save the music of Pachucos for next class. And so I will stop there with this topic.